You wake up in the dark, and at first you think it is night. Then you realize the ropes are colder than night. The air tastes of smoke and salt, or perhaps of brine carried from a distant river. You remember praying at dawn, the bell of your convent sounding like a promise. Now you are counted like cargo, by weight, by name scratched into a ledger you will never see. What the Ottoman army did to Eger was worse than death. That image, a woman pressed into a hold, senses narrowed to the press of wood and the metallic rattle of chains, is how many of these stories must begin. Not because it is the only truth, but because it is the only way to feel what the record often cannot tell us. Eger, the red-roofed town folding into the hills of northern Hungary, was more than stone and spire. It was a network of houses, chapels, convents, markets, and the fragile routines of daily devotion. When an army moved through that intimate geography, it did not only rearrange property, it reordered identities. Eger's place in the story of Ottoman expansion is complicated. There were sieges and battles in the region across the 16th and 17th centuries. The city's castle is famous for a heroic defense that repelled an Ottoman siege in 1552, yet the broader borderlands around Eger experienced waves of warfare, occupation, and reoccupation in the decades that followed. Pinning a single definitive episode of systematic atrocity on the Ottoman army and on Eger alone would be a mistake. Specific records for an event matching the pattern we will describe are, in places, indefinitive. Yet to ignore the patterns that do appear across the sources, administrative registers, contemporary reports, and archaeological traces, is to miss how violence can remake lives in ways that survive as law, lineage, and silence. This is not a simple tale of battlefield slaughter. This is a story of selection and sorting, of people turned into categories that answered military and economic needs. It is a story about how captivity can become a long, slow erasure, not only of life, but of speech, of names, of the rites that used to mark a day. And it is a story about memory, what was kept, what was buried, and how later generations rewrite the record. If this is the kind of history you want more of, please like and subscribe. There are many forgotten voices still to recover. We move now from the narrow dark into daylight, to the night before the streets burned. Imagine Eger as a living place, bells at dawn, market stalls, cloistered cells where women kept their vows. It was valuable because of its location, a waypoint between the plains and the mountains, and because, like many towns of the borderlands, it was a node of faith. Convents and parish churches held not only spiritual life, but social and economic networks, donors, tenants, charitable obligations. In wartime, that made them targets.
Reports from border chronicles describe armies arriving with the morning fog, scouts making contact with outlying villages, and cannon being rolled up to walls. In some episodes in the region, surprise and speed were decisive. Fortifications could be bypassed by bribery, undermined by treachery, or simply worn down by siege. But violence took many forms. Beyond the battering ram and the siege lift, another form of conquest took place in smaller spaces, within houses, in chapels, and in the yards of cloisters where the living were separated from the dead, and where those who survived a sacking might find themselves marked for removal rather than execution. Contemporary administrative sources, Ottoman cadastral records known as defters, as well as local notarized lists compiled under duress, show something striking about occupied territories. Households were redefined. Names that had once paid rent to a local lord now appeared in registers as headless or as reclassified under new owners. Tax lists may record the absence of an able-bodied male in a household, with the notation of a captive or of a woman put into the service of a new household. These dry lines hint at a human reality. When armies took towns, they also took people, and the act of taking was organized. What happened in that taking often followed a pattern. First, the battle, or the threat of battle, and the explosion of public violence meant that defenders and clerics could be killed in the street. Then came selection. Soldiers, camp officials, and local intermediaries sorted the survivors into categories: those to be killed, those to be sold at market, those to be kept for labor, and those to be placed into domestic service or into elite households. For some women in religious houses, this last category could mean a forced movement from consecrated life into servitude. Where the chronicles are silent about Eger specifically, comparative evidence from the region and from Ottoman administrative practice shows that armies commonly viewed the capture of dependents as both a punitive act and an economic opportunity. The act of choosing who lived and who became property was not random, it was bureaucratic. If you close your eyes again, picture a courtyard after the sack. Smoke hangs low, a small water basin tipped over, the embroidered cloth of a lectern trampled in mud. Men with registers and ropes stand apart from soldiers who break down doors. Women are gathered not only for safety, but for counting. The selection is both public and intimate. A ledger is consulted, a price is agreed, a name, if there is one, is erased or recorded under a foreign ownership. The logic behind the sorting is straightforward from a military administrative perspective. Those who could be ransomed or sold were assets. Those who could be integrated into the serving households of officers were resources to be cultivated. Those who remained a burden were a drain.
Institutional rationales, logistical, economic, and political, determined fates as much as the chaos of war. Here, we must be careful about specifics for Eger. Sources that detail particular rituals of humiliating captives in this town are indefinite. Where historians have strong evidence of systematic practices elsewhere in the Ottoman world, regulated slave markets, household incorporation of captives, and legal frameworks that govern servitude, those patterns can help us reconstruct what might have happened in Eger. But reconstruction is not fact, it is a disciplined guess, informed by archival fragments and by the predictable needs of occupying institutions. That distinction matters because the methods used to depersonalize captives were not merely physical, they were ritualized. They could be as small as a haircut or as large as a public ceremony intended to demonstrate subjection. In some regions under Ottoman rule, conversion to Islam was occasionally encouraged and sometimes facilitated by social incentives, yet it was rarely a simple matter of uniform coercion. More often, a captured woman's identity was eroded through a sequence of legal and social processes. Her legal name could be recorded under an owner's house, her religious role nullified by the loss of community, her clothing replaced, her kinship relations severed by sale. In other words, domination often worked by removing the supports that made identity durable. When chroniclers speak of humiliation, and some do in other border episodes, the acts they describe are both public and performative. A captive might be presented to a household and required to perform tasks that publicly marked the transfer of authority. In some cases, captors staged ceremonies that imitated local wedding or household rituals in order to restructure legal relationships of belonging. For Eger, we do not have a recorded ritual with ritualized bleeding or oath-taking in the sources we can point to confidently. To imagine such a scene as literally occurring there would be to invent. What we can responsibly do is to map the structure of those rituals onto what is documented for other contexts, and to present those as reconstructions, possible ways an occupying force could assert ownership over human beings. Composite reconstruction, based on patterns in the sources. The names, dialogues, and some scenes you will now hear are dramatized to make visible the structures historians see in records from the borderlands. They are not direct transcripts of events in Eger. Consider one such reconstructed moment. A convent's rectory has been turned into a market. A household official reads names from a book. In the courtyard, women stand in lines, some still wearing the habit's remnants. A local notary writes their statuses, sold, household, to be relocated. A woman whose hands never threaded a loom now learns the texture of a spoon handle in a foreign kitchen.
Another is handed to an officer who will claim her services. The scene is not meant to titillate or to satisfy curiosity. It is meant to show how everyday life, prayer, craft, the rhythms of labor, were converted into taxable labor and social utility. The consequences of this conversion run deep and long. One obvious result is forced reproductive labor. Women taken into domestic environments were sometimes expected to bear children for their captors or for the households in which they served. Pregnancy under captivity carries grave implications: lack of appropriate obstetric care, the psychological violence of bearing a child under coerced circumstances, and the long-term social consequences for children born into ambiguous status. Records and later demographic studies of the region indicate that population profiles changed. Some family lines disappear, others are complicated by mixed heritage and new social alignments. But the impact was not only biological, it was cultural. Children born of captives and captors navigated a liminal world. They might be raised within a household that practiced a different faith, yet be taught in secret the prayers of their mother. They might inherit language from both sides, and their burial practices might blend symbols. Archaeologists working in broader parts of the Carpathian Basin and Ottoman-controlled Hungary have noted graves with mixed assemblages: Christian symbols alongside Ottoman-era coins, ceramics from Anatolia interred with local folk objects. Isotopic analysis of bones from these graves sometimes reveals life histories of mobility, individuals showing dietary signatures from different regions, or childhood spent in places away from their presumed birthplace. These traces do not prove individual stories of rape or forced concubinage at Eger, but they do corroborate that intense cultural mixing happened in the wake of military occupation. The institutional silence that often follows such episodes compounds the harm. Official histories, whether commissioned by city elites, national chroniclers, or religious institutions, sometimes minimize the depredations that complicate heroic narratives. In the case of Eger, memory is contested. One famous narrative celebrates the defenders who repelled a siege. Other episodes, less flattering, are footnotes or omitted. That uneven remembering is not accidental. Municipal records, clergy accounts, and later nationalistic historiographies each had reasons to emphasize valor or to smooth over episodes that implicated local actors in shameful transactions. This selective amnesia produces another form of death, the erasure of testimonies and the obliteration of names from public commemoration. Yet erasure is never complete. The fragments remain. A monastery ledger with a lacuna where a list of nuns once was, a traveler's aside noting many women taken, the bones beneath a churchyard that tell, through chemistry, of multiple life geographies.
These fragments are the archaeologist's whispers and the historian's thin reeds. There were also acts of covert resistance. Captives found ways to preserve identity, secret prayers, hidden rosaries, teaching children the old rites in whispers at night. These small acts preserved cultural memory across generations. In other regions, some captives gained legal or social standing over time. Others used the courts to claim rights. Survival strategies were diverse. Some adapted outwardly while clinging inwardly to faith. Some negotiated power in households, leveraging skills like sewing, herbal knowledge, or literacy. These are not stories of simple triumph. They are stories of endurance and complicated agency. We must pause to reflect on motives. It is tempting to ascribe atrocities to essentialized religious hatred. That would be inaccurate and unfair. The primary motives of an occupying army are often practical: to secure supply lines, to punish resistance, to extract revenue, to reorganize the social fabric in ways that ensure control. Religion could provide justification or be instrumentalized, but it operates within a field of calculation that includes politics and economics. A command to take captives might be framed in religious language. The decision to incorporate women into households might be a matter of logistics and social custom adapted to new circumstances. That nuance matters because it shapes how we interpret both actions and remedies. Another nuance: legal frameworks. The Ottoman legal and administrative universe had rules governing slavery and servitude that were not arbitrary. Slaves could be bought and sold, they could be manumitted, they could even rise to influential positions in some circumstances. Devshirme, the levy of Christian boys to be raised as janissaries, is often misunderstood, and it was not a universal template for what happened to women. Where legal structures existed, they mediated the experience of captivity. Where law was absent or unevenly enforced in the chaos of war, ad hoc practices prevailed. For Eger, where direct legal documentation for specific acts is often missing or fragmented, we must triangulate between defters, travelers' accounts, local chronicles, and archaeology to build a plausible account. This triangulation is exactly what yields the painful phrase in our title, worse than death. What historians mean when they use a phrase like this is not that physical death did not occur. Of course it did. Rather, they are pointing to a destruction of the self that surviving witnesses sometimes described, an erasure that persists through generations. To be killed is to end a life. To be taken, renamed, forced into a service that nullifies the central markers of personhood is to enter a different, prolonged death, the death of social identity, of collective memory, of the rituals that marked a life as sacred. There were, however, unintended consequences to enforced proximity.
Over time, patterns of assimilation produced syncretic cultural forms. Children of mixed parentage sometimes served as cultural brokers. They could navigate both liturgical calendars, both culinary worlds, and both sets of legal obligations. In the long arc of history, these mediated forms could reshape religious and social landscapes. Some syncretic practices become normalized, others are later purged. This is not a story of straightforward conversion. It is a messy, morally fraught process in which power and survival co-produce new identities. Let us return to the human scale. Think of a woman who had been a novice, who had learned to tend an altar lamp, who now found herself in a household where her hands served a different master. She gave birth to a child who would learn to speak 2 tongues in a house that kept different prayers at night. The child's name might be recorded in an Ottoman register as belonging to a household. The mother's original name disappears. Decades later, an archaeologist opens a grave and finds a small locket with a Christian motif beside Wayne from Anatolia. That locket is the only literal token of the life that preceded occupation. The rest has to be read out of the soil.
These moments, the ledger, the locket, the isotopic signature, are the evidence historians can point to, but they also illuminate how fragile our certainties are. Where the record is silent, we must mark it so, indefinito. Where parallel cases allow cautious inference, we must be explicit about the method. Reconstruction is a tool, not a substitute for documentation. A crucial complication is the later retelling of these events by nation-states and churches that have a stake in their own narratives. Heroic defenses are turned into monuments. Uncomfortable episodes of collaboration, sale, or silence are excised. That pattern of amplification and omission shapes public memory. For Eger, the story that circulates in public commemorations focuses on valor. The stories of the captives are less likely to feature in civic memorials. Recovering their memory requires a different kind of archival work, reading tax ledgers for the gaps they hide, listening to folklore for the lines that mention a woman.
But in aggregate, they show a pattern. Occupation often produced long-term embodied harm that outlived the immediate violence. Resistance, however, persisted. Some captives sought legal redress, petitioning courts for manumission or the recovery of children. Others fled when opportunities arose. Yet escape was rarely a clean return to a previous life. Reconstituting a place in a community that had moved on, that had divided possessions, and that had rebuilt its rituals without you, is itself a form of exile. So, what should we make of the claim in the title that what happened in Eger was worse than death? The claim is not a provocation for its own sake. It is an ethical judgment about the effects of prolonged depersonalization. Killing is immediate and absolute. Enslavement, forced assimilation, and the destruction of social anchors leave survivors alive to endure a slow, eroding violence. The annihilation of communal memory, the erasure of names, rights, and the right to be remembered in a cemetery marked by kin, produces an afterlife of injury that often escapes the triumphant chronicles. At the same time, we must not simplify causality. Ottoman commanders did not have a single unified policy that read, "Make them suffer worse than death." They were actors within an empire that used captivity as a tool, and within local contexts where commanders, merchants, and intermediaries all made decisions. Attribution of moral responsibility must be careful, to institutions, to the exigencies of war, and to individuals who profited. Religious difference was sometimes rhetorical cover rather than primary motive. How historians and archaeologists reconstruct these stories is itself a moral act. Every choice about which ledger to read, which grave to open, and which language to use shapes which victims are hurt. The ethics of recovery require transparency. When we dramatize, we must mark the dramatization. When we infer, we must mark the inference. For Eger, the balance between known facts and plausible reconstruction leans toward the latter in many places. Restraint and explicit labeling are therefore non-negotiable. What can public memory do with these findings? First, it can recognize that the past is layered. Bravery and atrocity can coexist in the same town story. Second, it can enlarge the canon of remembrance to include those who were not combatants but who suffered in the aftermath. Memorials might carry additional plaques, museums might include testimonies from widows and captive women transposed from the archival scraps, and educational curriculum might teach the bureaucratic mechanics of how people were made legible to empires as property. Remembering is not a sentimental exercise. It is a commitment to acknowledge harms that policy and law once permitted. Finally, there is a stubborn human resilience to acknowledge.
Survivors taught children forbidden prayers, stitched hidden icons into clothing, and kept the memory of birthdays and saints' days alive in whispered kitchens. Those small acts meant that even where violence attempted to erase, something of identity persisted. That persistence complicates the phrase worse than death. Even a life under coercion can carry forms of resistance and creative survival that testify to human dignity. As we close, let us return to the hold and the woman who wakes to the cold rope. Her story is emblematic of many whose names are lost. We cannot always reconstruct the precise steps that led from chapel to courtyard to household ledger, but we can read the patterns and listen for the fragments they leave behind. We can acknowledge that what befell communities like Eger involved not only loss of life, but the slow dissolution of social identity. We can demand that future research be meticulous in labeling hypotheses and silent where evidence is absent. If this reconstruction has unsettled you, think of what it asks of us as readers of history: to refuse the comfort of tidy heroes-only narratives, to hold contradictions together, and to press archives for the stories of the vulnerable. If you would like to dig deeper, check the description for sources and suggested reading. Leave a comment with a forgotten episode you think deserves more attention. History has been too willing to forget the nameless. Calling out that memory,
insisting that what was done to Eger was not only an act of war, but an attempt at social erasure, is part of recovering those voices. We remember not to punish, but to testify that those who suffered were real people with names, who prayed, who cooked, who loved, and who tried in small ways to keep their souls intact.